Okay.
Oh, look at that. It's a brave new world. You guys still hear me?
I'm
Yeah.
afraid so.
Is it okay? Is it the whatever, the audio as good as it was before or bad as it was before?
Really closely, you'll see right in the expression on his face is that he didn't do that because he's seeing this blue gate coming up down below, and he is about 4 or 5 feet below where he should be. And the question is, did he prepare enough? And that's really what we want to talk about is, how do we think about what happened in 2020 and what are we going to change in 2021 to be able to withstand some of the things that we see, whether that's going to be excessive drought, excessive rain. And Gabe is Gabe could probably predict better than I can. But I think the thing we want to say is that almost everyone will agree that we seem to be facing more weather extremes, whether it's cold, wet, dry, or hot. And really what we want to do is be able to become better planners and be able to have the ability to take our situation it's given us with climate and try and figure out how are we going to adapt our grazing system and our haying system. So as normal, I know I'm a University of Maine employee. We need to talk about some of the drier things. And so one of the things that I wanted to talk about were 2 programs that grazers and hay producers may be interested in. One is the NAP program, which is the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program. And I do some of the assessments for this for FSA, but it's basically a crop insurance program that you can participate in. You have to buy in. Again, it's a crop insurance program, but it's subsidized. But again, it does help. And this past summer, I facilitated 2 farms that received considerable payments from participating in this program because of drought. And it requires 2 people to go visit your farm and assess your losses due to grazing. And haying. So that's one program. The other program, which is a little bit more interesting, I think, is the pasture and range forage rainfall program to try and figure out losses based on rainfall. And the reason I like this program is it doesn't require much effort on your part. Basically, you sign up for this program, you pay your entrance fee into the program, and if there is a drought, if there is a problem associated with weather-related dry conditions, you're going to get a payment. And the payment is based on rainfall data that doesn't even need to be collected by you. It's based on a grid pattern from weather patterns. And so it's a real easy program to participate in. So it's one that, in the long run, I think most people that have participated in this have come out ahead. And especially as we see more and more weather extremes, and probably you're going to potentially sign up for this program when we're going to have a really wet year and you're going to curse my name for a while. But I think if you continue participation in this, we're going to have years that you'll get a payment and years you won't. But I think most often you will probably get a payment. And so basically it protects against a loss due to dry conditions. You don't need to keep records. There's no loss adjustments. It's an area-based policy. It's based on where you live. And it's a very easy program to participate in. Again, so I would suggest looking into both of those programs, the NAP program as well as the pasture and range crop insurance program. And so again, some pros and cons of that. Basically, it is no records, no loss adjustments. The cons, it only covers you if there's a drought. And so again, I'm going to let you look up more information about that. So
Rick, just remind them when the sign up. There you go. Sorry.
The sign up was in November, unfortunately, for this coming year. So you're not going to be able to participate in this coming year. So, but it's a program to look into as we go forward and you continue your farming operations. You probably want to look into this and see what you may want to participate in coming next fall. So what do we learn from the 2020 season, Gabe?
Well, it was the driest season I've seen. I think that there's a lot of topics here that, have a big impact on people's production. Just quickly looking at the poll, seems like about 85% or 80% of you guys are interested in pasture management through the drought. I think there's a lot of key topics here as you look at trying to survive through a season like that, and figuring out how to best set you up something that we don't see coming ahead. So I think, Rick will lead into this, and all the folks that are on there and can hear us, if you guys want to send in questions as we're going, we're happy to jump through topics. Like Rick said, we'd rather have this be more of a dialogue. Rick and I talk too often, and a lot of the times I'm just trying to bait him into an argument anyway. So we thought it'd just be fun to do that in front of a bunch of people, and then besides by ourselves. But last season on my pastures, my pastures are pretty heavy soils. Rick's actually pulled up, I think, one of the best slides here. This gives you a good idea of what we looked at. And you look at that map, you got about that chart, you got about May 15th, and things started to get ugly. In the Northeast, I feel like we normally manage more through wet periods than dry periods, but that may have been just the average in the past. Now, out of the last 5 years, I'd say we've managed in a lot more, relatively speaking, drier years, and then a very dry year last year. If you didn't have any residuals after May 15th to hold down some fog, some dew, any kind of moisture you could, that chart probably is a fairly accurate piece of what your soils did. I know that most of our first crop that got done in late May and early June basically didn't grow back till you can see about that July 1st date when we had that rainfall. So I think that's a huge piece of what we saw last year, and trying to manage around that becomes a key strategy for how to deal with these more fluctuating weather patterns. For us, this meant a lot more residual, both in hayfields and pastures. I was a little bit lucky last year. I decided that when I did my first grazing, for years I'd said you can't do anything wrong in June when you're grazing because it's going to rain enough to fix it. But as you can see, 2020 proved that absolutely 100% wrong. And I just happened, it was a year we left a lot of residual, and it saved our whole year, I think. And that's the hardest part about this, is you've got to pick a point, early mid-May when you're going to start grazing. And if you start out wrong, it leads you the rest of the way. We saw that with some of our fields that we cut first crop off, and I got a little greedy for yield, and I didn't mow quite as high. And some of those fields a lot of those fields stood still and never regrew anything until that July rain.
So I think that's a really important point in terms of both mowing and grazing. If we graze really hard, or if we mow really short, we're going to increase the amount of soil moisture loss just from evaporation off the soil surface. Whereas if we retain a fair amount of residual, we keep that soil covered and try and minimize how much loss we had just from evaporation from the soil surface and seeing bare soil. I think that's critical. And I think, I'm going to come at it from the haying perspective in terms of trying to mow your hay a lot higher than you normally do. And realize that when you do that, you may be leaving some feed in the field, but you're also leaving the least nutritious part of that feed in the field. So you're leaving more stalk and taking most of the leaves where most of the nutritional components that you're interested in are going to be. So, finding ways to mow higher. And Gabe, maybe you could talk a little bit about the potential shoes you used on your mower to cut higher.
Yeah, so not trying to endorse or non-endorse any specific mower. We happen to use a later model, or not a later model, an older New Holland mower, but we've installed different shoes on it, so they're a high mowing shoe. At this point, I wouldn't look at a newer mower that didn't have the capability to potentially get me to about 6 inches of residual. And I think that that's really hard for folks to measure, to evaluate. I think that there's a lot of folks I talk to, and you say, do you leave a lot? Do you leave do you use a high mowing shoe or leave a lot of residual when you're mowing hay? I hear a lot of them say yes. And then you go into that field, and when you really measure it out, you got 2-3 inches of residual. I think what in this chart and looking at the residual and talking about how this works, the other piece is that soil heating. It's not just the moisture loss, but then you also compound the issue from heating the soil. And Rick, if you want to speculate a little bit on how that heating affects things, but high mowing shoes to me are a must-have. I think after this year I've learned enough lessons that I probably will just always mow as high as I can.
So obviously, if you've got soil showing, that's a darker color. And so that's going to absorb more heat. So your soil temperatures are going to go up. And we're also looking at growing cool season forages. Most of our pastures and hay fields, at least in Maine, are cool season forages, meaning they like it cool and moist. And if we give them a hot, dry condition, they're just going to shut down. I mean, the classic example of that is bluegrass, and bluegrass shuts right down. And as soon as it sees heat and dry weather, it shuts right down and stays fairly dormant until we get another rainfall and cooler weather. So again, that's really critical. And again, thinking about how much residual you leave, that also allows in a grazing situation for those plants to respond quicker in terms of their regrowth, because plants are going to regrow from either two sources, whether they make their own food through photosynthesis or they're going to pull carbohydrate reserves from the root system. And if you leave more residual, that's more green matter, so their regrowth is going to be less dependent on pulling reserves out of the soil, and allow them to make more of their own food through photosynthesis rather than trying to pull it out of carbohydrate reserves out of the soil, and potentially have help you develop a better root system as well as a deeper root system to tap more water.
So we got a question on adequate amount of residual. I don't know if that's what you were getting after asking me, Rick, but adequate I think is a little bit subjective, but I in hay fields, I would say it's 4 to 6 inches. Rick's the guy with the PhD, or too many acronyms behind his name, so he can weigh in. I just was arguing with a guy the other day about moisture level in bales, and I'm just the farmer. But adequate, I would say in hay fields is 4 to 6 inches. In pastures, I think we probably need to start looking more at probably like the 8-inch level. I think it's a lot of grass to leave behind, but in a year like last year, I think a critical component in looking at that is the nutritional needs of your animals. If you have a lower class nutrition need animal, you can go back and clean up some of that product, that grass you left behind in a pinch later in the year. Not going to be the greatest forage, not going to have the greatest nutritional quality, but if you're running a low nutritional need animal, brood cows, something like that are later in lactation or dry, when you go out west, those animals can survive off, grain stubble. So, past due grass in the Northeast is not going to be horrible. It's not ideal, but it's not horrible. But I was telling Rick earlier, if I could have left a foot of residual, if I'd had the growth early on to leave that much, that would have really armored that soil to withstand that dry period. In our specific location, we get a lot of fog and a lot of heavy dew, and that limped our pastures along. And the more residual I left, the better that did for them.
I think Gabe makes a really good point in terms of looking at your pastures in terms of the nutrient requirements of your animals. And so, I do most of my work with dairy cows, and dairy cows, milking cows, have a really high need or a high plane of nutrition to meet their production needs for milk. Whereas a cow in maintenance, a beef cow that's in maintenance, or maybe just getting done having her calf come off of her nutrient requirements are relatively low. And the same thing for, some of the animals that might be backgroundings versus a dairy cow. So you need to look at it that way in terms of what's the quality. And it doesn't hurt to go out there sometimes and take a clipping before they graze and take a clipping after they graze and try and figure out what's the nutritional quality they actually consumed, and did my management system help them meet those needs. So, trying to figure out some quality. And again, it's hard to take a quality sample from a field, but if you decide to do that, I would say, in a grazing field, take a cutting and a sample before they graze and then one after they graze. And then you can figure out, what did they consume and what was the quality potentially of what they consumed.
Yeah, I think the forage sampling, it's time consuming. It costs a little bit. It's not something we all think about, but it does sure teach you a lot about what's going on in your land. A huge proponent of that. Don't have to do it a ton. Dairy side, it should be done a lot more, but all of us can learn a lot from that. There's another question quickly about high mowing shoes in New England hay fields. We have had no issues, and I run a pretty decent diversity of land. We've got a lot of sandy land, but we run some pretty heavy, thick stuff at times. I've been through millet, sorghum. I've been through every cool season grass you can probably think of. Your shoes shouldn't be the issue. Where we run into issues with the high mowing shoes is more on short grass. If you're trying to clip fields every 28 days that are under a foot tall or a foot tall because you're truly trying to run really high quality forage through. Sometimes we don't get as clean of a cut, but that could be my mower. That may not be the shoes. So I have not had any issue with high mowing shoes due to binding or anything like that. Go ahead, Britt.
So I'm kind of moving on to the next slide and saying, you know, what happened in 2020 and does that give us some opportunities? I'm always looking for the glass half full situation here. And so from what I saw in a lot of fields in Maine, grazing fields, is that, you know, we were short of forage, you know, whether that be hay or silage for winter season or pasture. You know, there wasn't much yield. And so going into the fall, I think a lot of fields got overgrazed. And it's something that we try and tell people not to do. But if you're short of feed and you've got 100 cows out there bellowing, you're going to try and get them to eat as much as they can off those fields and try and minimize how much you have to feed them of your stored feed, which is probably going to be short as well. So I put this slide up to think about what opportunities did that give us for moving into 2021 season. You know, obviously many people probably did some damage to those fields, but again, what does that give you for an opportunity? And so here are some things that I'm thinking of. You know, obviously we talk about frost seeding, and frost seeding works best when there's little competition, meaning that you can potentially go out there, spread some seeds. You know, I talked to one of my dairy grazing apprenticeship graduates yesterday, and she's out in Western New York, and she was frost seeding. So frost seeding would be going out there, and most often we use red clover just because red clover seed is relatively cheap and it's heavy, and it's probably the most successful species of forage that we can do for frost seeding. And we're going to spread that seed, and hopefully the freezing and thawing action is going to let that seed fall into a crack and potentially germinate. And that works best when you've got little interference, meaning you don't have much residual. You may have some open space where that seed is going to fall on soil and not on forage. And that's where it's going to work the best. So in these situations, I think frost seeding might be a really good thing to do this year to try and introduce more legumes and more diversity into your pastures and your hay fields. So you may say, well, I've frost seeded in the past and it doesn't work, but maybe since you overgrazed this past fall, frost seeding might be a good opportunity for you. And the same thing is true if you're going to think about, you know, tilling into some sod right now. Again, if you've had some fields that really suffered from the drought, and you know, again, when we no-till, the real issue there is if you're no-tilling into an existing sod, how do you reduce that competition? And if we get an early spring and the grasses haven't started growing yet, and you can still drive on your fields with a no-till drill, it's a great opportunity to introduce new grass and legume species in. And using a no-till drill is the best way to do that, at least the most efficient way to do that in terms of grass seed utilization and clover seed. And I was on a webinar the other day with obviously someone who sells grass and forage seeds, but his recommendation was that every field should have new species potentially introduced to it every 3 to 5 years with a no-till drill. I thought that was an interesting observation for him. Obviously, he was a seed salesperson, but I do think the potential for adding new species in and diversifying the mixture that you have in your fields is a good way to try and minimize the potential for crop disaster, meaning that if you have only 1 or 2 species of grasses or legumes and they have a bad year, you're going to suffer more damage and more loss of crop. Where if you have multiple species, 5 or 6 different species of grasses or legumes, you spread your risk around. And again, spreading your risk around helps in terms of overcoming some of the potentials when we have bad weather conditions. So Gabe, have you done any early no-till spring seedings?
So we've done some no-till. We've done some frost seeding, and maybe not in full agreement with Rick, but what we've moved to a lot more is seed through our manure spreader. When we can have relatively mild manure, something preferably a little bit composted or at least older, so it's breaking down. We've really, it's such a slow transition process. I haven't seen interseeding be tremendously successful in really totally changing a field. So we like, for us, we really like putting it through the manure spreader, especially if it's, now it's not early spring, but especially if it's mid to later in the year where we can have some real composted stuff. That seemed to be something that works well for us. It's kind of an old fashioned thing, but we're going to do more with some of our hay fields. Looking at, actually, there's a question that's popped up about species recommendations for drought tolerance. So, you know, the fellow pointed out the bluegrass burned in his sandy soils. I have a lot of sand. I consider bluegrass actually my biggest weed. And it just, you know, that's exactly the kind of thing that you need to try to manage around. We've got a lot of hay fields that are what I call legacy fields or historical fields. These are fields that were fields before I ever got here, thought about farming, I'm sure. And they're, you know, bluegrass, white clover, maybe a little bit of timothy in there. And we really just got to get stronger stalks, broader leafed, taller growing, probably therefore a deeper rooted species taking hold in there, so that you don't see that just absolute cliff that we saw this last year in forage production. And white clover, I mean, we started in the spring and it was growing good. And then when it started to get dry, that stuff just tanked, and it just, you know, it was something there covering your soil, but it did not grow. And there was no nutrition for the animals. It was might as well have been a short cover crop that was sitting there just at least holding the soil together. So I think there's probably more to do with frost seeding from my standpoint. I think there's more to do with no-till. I think the one hard thing about no-till, and I would caution people of this, in Maine, we've got a little 6-foot no-till drill that runs around the state for rental. And it's nice, it's great, but it's really slow. You know, doing 10, 15 acres is kind of a day. So sometimes to get through some larger acreage, you know, that can be a tool that can be hard to find the right one. I think when you're using those heavier seeds like red clover, anything round and heavy, I'm not sure if the drill gets you much. Some of the grass seeds, I think there could be a little bit of an advantage.
So
Rick, there's a question on taking forage samples. Do you want to? Oh, go ahead.
I'll do that question, and I just want to add one thing about the tilling into sod to no-till and new species. And it gets back to that bluegrass question. So if you've got a hay field that's predominantly bluegrass, or a pasture that's predominantly bluegrass right now, realize that is a sod forming grass, just like quackgrass. You know, it's going to spread underground. It's going to form a really tight sod, meaning that if you try and no-till into that, it's probably not going to be all that successful. So, I mean, if your sod is, you know, 95% bluegrass, which I see a lot of fields are, it's going to be very difficult to introduce new species into that, just because of the way bluegrass grows, and it's a really tight sod. And the same thing if you've got a lot of quackgrass in there, it's pretty hard to get a new seedling established when you've got so much competition. So in that situation, you may want to think about renovation, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But the question about how to take a pasture sample, it's a very good one. You know, and it gets discussed a variety of ways. And what I was talking about is actually going out there and clipping before they graze, meaning you go out there and take a quadrat, which could be, you know, 1 meter by 1 meter, or even smaller than that, because I get tired of clipping. So, you know, 1 foot by 1 foot, and you can do your calculation back out to figure out what your yield is. But I like to clip, you know, usually about 3 inches high, and I clip everything. And then after they graze, I go back and I clip everything at that same height that's left over. And that's the best way in terms of what I'm thinking about, in terms of what did they eat, what didn't they eat, and what's left. Other researchers, and we talk about watching how the cows graze, and say, well, I'm going to go out there and take a sample based on how I see them graze, and see if I can represent the sample I take by what they ate and what they're consuming based on what I see how they graze. So there's 2 ways to think about it. I like the easier way, what in my opinion is going out before they graze, taking a complete sample of a 2 meter square, or going out and then when they're done grazing, go about and take the same sample, same size sample, and figure out what they ate and what they didn't eat. So there's a debate on the best way to take samples, but that's my way of doing it.
So I'm going to jump back in because the fellow asked specifically about drought tolerant species that are drought tolerant besides bluegrass. And it's one of my pet peeves is asking Rick a question like that and then totally getting off topic and not getting the exact question I asked answered. And I'm trying to find, I don't have my sticky
That's
notes.
what makes
here.
a good extension person. We don't answer the question. We beat around the bush.
They tell you so much, you think you're happy when you left, and then you walk away and half a day later you go, wait a second. But from my perspective, I learned my lesson. I planted a field with only bunch grasses once, and the field is the highest yielding field I have, but I don't have the soil cover that I'm really looking for. So bunch grass is being like an orchard grass. So I really do like orchard grass, but really pairing it with something that's tillering, that's sod producing, like the bluegrass Rick's talking about. So with that, right now, meadow fescue is a big one that's popular. Rick can talk about that if he wants. There's some of the perennial ryegrasses. There's some survivability issues potentially there. Tall fescue is something that is from where I used to live that I like a little bit, but it's not real popular in New England. But right now we're doing a lot with the meadow fescue and the orchard grass. And then I do always throw in a little bit of Timothy. I feel like even though Timothy's not really what I want in my fields, like a clearing in the woods from where they logged 3 years ago usually has Timothy growing in it. It seems to grow really well in Maine. So it's something nice to guarantee you get a little bit of establishment. Instead of nurse crops that are traditional, like oats and peas, we've been playing around with annual rye, and now I'm starting to use annual rye a little bit more on other places, and I could see it potentially being something. I guess I'm getting off topic here, but it's something that you could use more in a going back to frost seeding. But I do think, looking at Rick probably hates this one. I also do like reed canary grass. If you can grow it where you can manage it, it puts on volume like nothing else. But Rick, drought tolerant species for New England that are, and I'm assuming we're talking cool season here, not warm season.
Yeah. So, cool
Perennial's
season
not
grasses, probably, I hate to say it, but Reed's canary grass is probably the most drought tolerant of all the grasses. It's also one that grows extremely well in wet soil conditions. And the problem that we have in Maine is that it does predominate in those wet soil conditions. And if you can't harvest that, whether it's grazing or through harvest mechanically, it gets to be about 4 feet tall and completely indigestible and pretty worthless in terms of its feed value. So that's why I stay away from suggesting that. But
you got to plant it where you can get to it. It's got to be a field you can get into anytime you want, whether it be with livestock or machinery. But if it's somewhere you usually want to be with machinery, you got to be able to get livestock in there because, Rick does not exaggerate. When it gets away, we have a lot of it and we've had it get away. And we've trampled more reed canary into the ground than I care to imagine, but that's the best thing to have done with it.
So, in terms of other, most of the legumes are going to be a lot more drought tolerant than the grasses. So that's why it's good to have that diversity of both broadleaf and grasses in your system. And I think that helps in terms of both nutrient management as well as the ability to withstand some drought. You have to think about that in terms of when you're grazing, what's going to survive. Obviously, alfalfa does a great job in terms of having a deep taproot and getting moisture down deep, but does alfalfa survive very well in a grazing system? And obviously there's some varieties out there that do better than others. But it's one of those crops that does give you that drought resistance if you can get it to survive. And just getting alfalfa to survive in Maine is always a challenge to start with. I saw some other questions.
Well, real quick. So just while we're on varieties, Rachel did point out that reed canary is considered an invasive in Vermont. That's fair to say.
I think it's invasive in Connecticut as well. I think it's listed as an invasive species. And, old reed canary,
the high
also contains a glycoalkaloid, which makes it relatively impalatable. And so, if you're going to do reed canary, make sure you use an improved variety that has low glycoalkaloid concentrations in it.
Um, there was another person pointed out that on no-till drilling, and it's often a year later that you see it. I think that is a good point to make. A lot of these pasture renovation techniques, unless you're doing a total real renovation, but if you're frost seeding, if you're no-tilling, if you're putting it into as manure, any of those systems, it's really going to be a year or two later. But I would recommend, if you have the opportunity, one of my favorite things to do is take a field, especially if you have these bluegrass fields, put one variety in one field, put another variety in another field, just one variety, and you'll get a really good idea. If you can do it under really similar conditions, you get a clear idea of how those species will react under those conditions. So we've done like a field with orchard grass and a field with meadow fescue to see what established better. I think it's hard because every year is different and every weather system is different, but it does give you some idea of how competitive they are in your environment.
So I'm going to move us along a little bit, since we've already spent a half an hour on topics, and I have a lot more slides if we ever get to them, but I'm not sure we will. But if you do have those pastures that got beat up last year that you abused, now's the time to think about, how do we want to potentially renovate that, and do we want to use a summer annual? Now, summer annuals are crops that do well in hot, dry conditions. And so I always think about using a summer annual as kind of a transition crop to a new seeding. And so if you've got those pastures that were beat up last fall, that you didn't leave any residual for good spring growth, maybe now's the time to think about, do I want to take some of those areas in my hayfield or my pasture and think about putting in a summer annual? And, we're talking about crops like sorghum Sudan grass. I think millet is probably the most popular one that I've seen for grazing animals at this point. And you can get a variety of millets, including millets that contain the BMR gene, which is a brown midrib gene, which makes that crop even more digestible and more nutritious for animals. And so you may want to think about, do I want to take some of my hayfields or some of my pastures and till them up and sow a summer annual? So and then also think about, well, maybe I need to just build more diversity into my system. And again, I like this slide because, you look at that pasture and you see a variety of plants. You see chicory, you see clover, you see grasses, you probably see some weeds in there as well. But I also think that helps build diversity and resilience in terms of trying to, introduce species or have species in your hayfield that can withstand the variety of conditions we may or may not get this coming summer, whether that's dry weather, whether that's heavy rain. But having that diversity, something's going to do relatively well. So that's why I have this slide in here. And then that diversity.
Hold up, go back 1 second. One key point when you look at this, I don't know how many other people, for the folks who commented who got sandy ground like me, parts of my lawn went just brown. But what was the one thing that wasn't brown? Dandelions. And it's not only that they were staying green, but they were also probably pulling some moisture up, you'd hope. Having that diversity is really going to help have the diverse root structure. It's not just what you see above ground, it's also what's underground. And I do think down in the left corner, Rick, is that bed straw?
If it is, I don't want to see it.
Go ahead, sorry.
So again, it's not just having that resilience. It gives you that potential of something green and growing, but also when you look at, really, we're not grass farmers, we're solar collectors and trying to maximize how much solar radiation we collect. And having a diversity of leaf architecture out there helps in terms of photosynthetic capacity of your hayfield. And the more ability to collect that solar radiation and turning into something green that's growing that your animals are going to eat is going to be more productive for you. So not only are you trying to buffer yourself against extremes in terms of whether that's drought or rainfall, you're also trying to improve the photosynthetic capacity of your soils. So I think it's really important that we really focus in on diversity versus, one or two species. The more diverse we have, it also gives the animals a little better, adaptation ability in terms of trying to find out what they feel that they need, whether it's a grass that has less crude protein in it versus a legume that has a higher crude protein. And I think there is some regulatory mechanisms that the cows have in terms of trying to decide what they want to eat and what they don't want to eat based on their nutrient requirements. So Gabe doesn't like this slide, but I'm going to put it in here anyway. And so when we think about this in terms of how our normal cool season pastures grow, we have this traditional curve. We have a spring flush of growth, and then if things dry out, we go through what's considered a summer slump. And so we can debate, and Gabe will debate with me, whether we really have this summer slump in New England or in Maine at least. Gabe thinks we have a plateau versus a slump. And years we do. I think there's certain years where we don't really see a big summer slump. We have a cool, wet year. You're not going to see much of that at all. So I think it's something to think about in terms of how do we budget. And one of the ways we budget is we take all this huge amount that we have early in the season and we take some of that off as a hay crop. And so we have that surplus in the spring. We have a hay crop that we take off to manage that big flush of growth. And then, we try and take that drier period that occurs in July and August and take some of those hay fields, and then we're going to graze them. So we increase the acreage and the amount of fields that we graze. One way we can buffer against some of those, or add at least to our grazing season, is to put in some cereal grains. So winter rye, winter triticale, winter wheat, all those are potentially cereal grains that we can sow in the fall. So again, looking at a rotation and saying, hey, I'm going to renovate a field. I'm going to till it in late August or early September, and I'm going to sow a winter grain, winter rye, triticale, winter wheat, whatever you want. And that is actually going to grow relatively well going into October and November. And if it grows well enough, you may even want to lightly graze that. So you get some feed that potentially you could use for your animals late in the fall. And then those cereal grains grow very rapidly in the spring. So they're actually growing earlier than most of our cool season grasses. So you potentially could get a grazing or two off those early in the spring. Get your animals out on those fields earlier. And then if you want to, you can graze those really hard and then reseed that into a summer annual later on, or even to a cool season grass. So brassicas are another crop, and I don't have a lot of experience growing brassicas. I think some of our researchers in Massachusetts, whether, I don't know if Sam Glaze Cochran is on this webinar or not, but if she is, she's done a lot of work with Masood down in Massachusetts on brassicas and brassica growth going into the fall. But you can get substantial amount of biomass by sowing some brassicas in early August or even late July, and really give you a fair amount of grazing going into the fall. So another way to increase your grazing season. And the one that gets a lot of attention is taking those summer annuals, those warm season annuals. So something like a millet or a sorghum sudan grass or forage sorghum, and find a way to use that as part of your rotation crop, whether that's taking that cereal grain that you grew in the fall and in the early spring, terminating that and then planting a warm season annual that you can graze or harvest. And then in late August, early September, you can terminate that warm season grass and sow, a cool season forage, perennial forage for the following year. So this is ways to try and diversify your forage mix so you're better able to withstand any extremes that we see, as well as a system. Again, I like systems that look at improving your fields over time without minimizing how much loss you have by taking that field out of production. So if you can use some of these crops as an intermediary between getting rid of an established perennial sod and getting into a new perennial sod without losing a lot of time and a lot of growth, these are some ways you can do that, whether that's brassicas, cereal grains, or warm season annuals.
And I think we've basically done all of these here. I think the one thing I would warn against, we've used this a lot in transition of fields in terms of bringing them into higher production or bringing them into better production. But I do think you really need to closely look at weighing the cost of setting up these systems with tillage. Time, cost, equipment are significant. And I'm not sure if I take a field that I put into a good high quality mix of warm season grasses, we've run brassicas in there, and we've actually run everything but cool season grasses listed here together. And a good cool season grass pasture, I do think I get competitive production from over the season. But if you have an issue where you don't have good cool season pastures or hay fields already, utilizing these tools to change that in an off year or two can be really helpful. The other thing you have to watch out for is as you go into potentially a tillage system, you're changing your selectivity for weed base. And when you do go to get out of it, you'll have a very different weed composition than you may have had in the past. We definitely found that. We ran a field through mixtures for 3 years running and then went back into perennial with it. And we had pigweed that we'd never seen before, but in a lot of it. So when we went to go back to cool seasons, the pigweed was much more aggressive, and we had a hay crop that some of it we should have just some of it we did compost.
So Bill makes a really good point that I should have said as well. With the brassicas, there's two things you want to consider. One is when you're doing a brassica field, you probably don't want your animals eating 100% brassica that day, because you want to transition them onto something that's going to maintain their fiber, mat, and their rumen. And if you turn them out into a field of brassicas, they're probably not going to do that. It's so digestible and there's not enough fiber in that. So when you're doing, especially grazing brassicas, you need to make sure you feed some of that and strip feed it, or however you want to do it. But he also makes the point that, these brassicas grow really well in early fall and they maintain their quality. So basically it's that, he talks about stored energy and stored solar radiation. And it's a good point, because it does, create a feed that holds its value well into, November. And so if you're looking at maintaining good quality feed for your animals well into the season, that's one crop that'll do that for you. So thank you, Bill.
The other point is about tillage with this. I mean, I'll tell folks, we've basically tried almost all of these things with no-till and with tillage. I'm not a big fan of the tillage. I don't see, at this point, we only till when we have to. And by have to, I mean, we've had a time where hayfields have gotten destroyed by people who think they have monster trucks. But with no-till, it is, Rick, this is one of our favorite old debates. How do I till a warm season annual into a cool season pasture and make it successful? It's really hard to get that seedling to compete with an established an established stand. And I haven't been able to damage a stand enough without chemicals to make it work. I think if you wanted to use some chemicals, you'd probably have very good success, but without them, which we've struggled.
It is, and we've tried a variety of ways to do that, and I've tried it with cereal grains in the fall, to take a pasture that gets really beat up and then drill in, a winter rye or something like that to give me a little extra grazing going into late October, early November, as well as potentially in the spring. And even there, where we really beat up the pasture with animals, or we actually took a mower out there, a flail mower, and mowed as low as we possibly could, meaning that we were almost tilling the soil. That, especially if you've got something like a bluegrass sod in there, it has an amazing ability to come back and compete. So it's one of those tough ones. But again, you need to think about how you're going to set that back. And again, without the use of herbicides can do a good job for you. We've done trials in the past where we actually just sprayed herbicides in strips and drilled right into those killed strips, and that worked pretty well without having to kill the sod completely. Also reduce the amount of herbicide you need to do to get the job done effectively.
I think the best setup we've ever had trying to do it no-till without herbicides was we took a field, we took second crop off on July 4th or just about. We went back in the day after we got the hay baled off of it, and I dropped the mower down to its lowest level, which had to be in the 1 to 2 inch level, and cut it again. 3 days after it had been cut it probably 4 to 6 inches, chopped it right down to nothing. No-tilled into it with a warm season annual, probably a millet or a sorghum sedan, and put some manure on it. And there was a plant here or there, but it didn't make it worthwhile.
So I put this picture up because if we're talking about doing some of these warm season annuals, you may want to think about how you seed them, because you may not want to take 20 acres and seed 20 acres to pearl millet in one day, because here's the difference in the same field, and between July 18th and August 5th, and you can see the difference in height. So these warm season annuals, if they get some hot weather, they're going to take off. And so by August in this one field, those cows, you can hardly find the cows because the millet, and you can see a fair amount of weeds in there as well. But you got to realize that maybe you want to spread out your seeding so it's not all going to be done at the same time. And that's one of the things that I see as well, is that the producers will seed a whole bunch of it, and it's going to go through various stages very, very quickly, just like cool season grasses go from vegetative to reproductive. And it seems like within 2 weeks in late May and early June, the sorghum Sudan grass or millet, any of these warm season crops are going to really take off. The advantage of a brown midrib sorghum Sudan or a brown midrib pearl millet is that the quality is not going to decline too much, but you've got to think about how you're going to feed it and how it's going to grow. And so a lot of the times you're going to be feeding it this way, where you're just going to have a electric fence that you're going to move a few feet every day. And again, trying to figure out exactly when to seed and how you're going to graze is going to be a little bit of a science that you have to learn as you practice using some of these crops.
And grazing these, I mean, I think it really gets, another time to get back to the idea of what class of, what nutritional requirement is of those animals. We now break up our herds based up nutritional requirements, and it allows us to manage, those with a high need versus those with a low need. But it gets hard when you get animals spread across a farm and you have a low group and a high group and you're trying to meet all that. But I would be ready your first year you do these you got to be patient to get to where there's enough there. But then if you've got too big of a field, by the time we usually are doing about 20-acre blocks, and it take us about a week, 10 days to get through them. And by the time you get to the end of the other end of that, it'd be amazing the difference between 10 days.
So I'm not sure if the participants on this can see the questions that are coming in. But Bill had another good point, saying that if you're going to prepare a sod for no-till seeding, you've got to set it back enough and then look at it and say, oh my God, what did I do to that field before you put the no-till drill in? I actually almost think about doing it in somewhat of a different way, meaning that I would actually turn that field into get it destroyed in terms of the cows grazing it really hard or mowing it really hard, letting it grow back a little bit more, and then turning the cows in one more time just to really set it back, or seed it and then turn the cows out again. Try and really minimize the competition. So good point.
And somebody else commented on multiple mowings. I mean, it's all the same idea. You've got to beat up that grass that's in there as much as physically possible. And it doing it with the cows is obviously going to be a little cheaper, a lot cheaper versus time and all those things. But I don't know. It's a struggle to beat land up that much sometimes.
I'm going to just go on to this because I know Gabe wanted to talk a little bit about it in terms of your grazing management and figuring out how. And, we talked about residual and talked about, we hear a lot about high density grazing in terms of trying to produce a lot of animals and also leaving a lot of residual. And really you need to think about, what kind of animal you're feeding and what do they need for nutrient requirements, and how does that fit into some of these high density grazing systems? And should they be in a high density grazing system? And again, I come from, a dairy perspective, and a dairy cow has fairly high nutritional needs when she's milking 60, 70, 80 pounds of milk per cow per day. And so I'm always looking at higher quality feed that's going to have relatively high protein and high energy. Whereas if you've got animals that are on a relatively low plane of nutrition, you can turn them out into stands that have a lot higher volume of feed out there, maybe a little bit higher in maturity. The nutritional needs aren't that high, and you can try these ultra high stocking densities and have them, consume what they can, as well as trample in a fair amount of material to try and improve soil health and provide some of that cover, especially going into hot, dry summers as well. So just realize what are your animal needs, what do they need in terms of protein, what do they need in terms of energy, and make sure that you match your grazing system to the animals. And so, if you've got different classes of animals, that helps you rotate your pastures around a little bit differently as well.
Well, I think your last point down there, that not too much or too much protein can cause weight loss, is something that for those of you that really are getting intensive with this process, we've done it actually both summer and winter. You can overfeed, especially if you're looking at really a, either 100% grass-based or really high forage diet animal. We can produce 20+% protein, stored feed and pasture fairly easily in New England. And there is no class of livestock that needs 20+% protein diet. Even a high production dairy cow doesn't need that much, especially because it's all going to be degradable protein. And so you can overfeed them. So I think that's something worth understanding. Finishing beef cow, you're still not much over 14-15% protein in their total diet. So we have that opportunity to really over push it. Having those lower quality feed need animals can really help you in the spring, being able to leave a lot of feed behind and then have a group that can kind of be your mop up group. It's your janitor cows. They're going to clean up after everybody else. And, that has a real place, especially hedging against these dry summers. I mean, it'd be interesting to hear from other folks that 2 summers ago, we had about a 200% forage crop, I would say, versus average. And last summer, I would say we had about a 60% forage crop versus average. So that swing was, if those were your first 2 years farming, you'd have to question your sanity and your location. That would be my thought. But
so I want to make one last point because we're running out of time. And so we talked about dry soils, but I want to talk about grazing on really wet soils because, chances are we're going to have a really wet summer now after we've done this talk about dry summers. And I want to make sure that people realize that animals do cause compaction. And if we do have wet years, you want to think about how you manage your pastures under wet soil conditions. And so this was really brought home to me this past year when we did some soil health trainings and we looked at soils. And if you look at these are samples from just 2 feet apart in a pasture. And so the difference here is what? What do you think the difference is between these two? Obviously, one's more compacted than the other, and we all would rather have the soil on the left versus the soil on the right. But why do you think there's a difference there? Anybody want to guess? Anybody who hasn't seen me give this presentation before? Well, the soil on the left, which is the one we like, that sample was taken right under the electric fence, whereas the soil on the right, the compacted soil, was taken in the middle of the pasture. So you can see the difference between where cows were and where cows were not. And this was very heavy soils. This is down in Freeport at Wolf's Neck Farm where they have very heavy soils. And obviously the soils were very compacted, potentially due to grazing wet soil conditions. So you may need to think about that as well in terms of how you design your systems going to this summer. And if we do have wet, maybe you need to think about where and how you graze at certain times. So I just wanted to throw that in there because it was incredibly revealing to me that I would have never suspected that much difference between right under the electric fence versus in the pasture. So Michelle, we're just about out of time. I don't know if you want to jump in and say anything as we get done.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
I think we're all set with answering the questions, and if you guys are all done, then we will end. Thanks.
We're supposed to get done at 1:30, right?
See, everyone's still on. Do you have anything else that you want to cover?
Anybody have any other questions, additional questions? Another question just came in, I think.
Yep.
Thank you, Kathy. Appreciate that.
Rachel raised her hand.
We don't let Rachel ask questions.
Oh.
We don't let Rachel ask me.
Rachel knows too much already. So what was your question, Rachel?
You got to do it in the Q&A
yeah.
box. She's going to type it in the chat or something to give us a hard time.
Nope, she's got it. Oh, she just wanted to give you two a hard time. You called it.
There you
If you've
go.
got a second, this is something that I just put
Put
in
it
a
up,
recent
yeah.
presentation about round bale hay, because we're in this huge hay deficit in Maine, meaning that hay in Maine is now selling for about $400 a ton, which is usually
True.
which is
That's
almost
supreme quality alfalfa out west.
which is usually twice the price we normally pay for hay. And one of my pet peeves is round bales of hay stored outside. And so
Especially left in the field lonely.
left in the field outside. So this is a diagram, and I got this from Hay and Forage Grower from Mike Rankin. But it shows a round bale of hay just sitting on the ground in a relatively dry storage area under cover. But it shows the moisture content, and the darker the red, the drier. And so you can see it does, even in a stored open barn, that's completely covered, at least the hay is covered, it's still picking up a little bit of moisture. But if you go and look at bales outside, no other bales around it, you can see that it's picking up a considerable amount of moisture. So down at that bale, that's 40%, and it's not nearly as dry as we'd like to see it. Most dry hay we want to see around a 10 to 12% moisture, and here we're getting in the 12, 15, 16% moisture level. And so let's look at more worst case scenarios. This is in a bunch of bales stored outside in a row running north-south with bales tight together, meaning they're all lined up right together. And in that situation, we have limited air movement around those bales. And you can see that the moisture content over here, we're getting to the point where, only, half of that bale probably has nutritional qualities that it probably started with. And we've lost a lot of quality. We've got potential for molds and mycotoxins growing in. So round bales stored outside, and we do see them like this, stored in a row running north-south. We see that all the time. And it's a huge waste. And if if hay is selling at $400 a ton, there's a lot of money you put into producing that bale that's just getting thrown away. You can say, well, I'm going to feed it and all those nutrients are going to go into my soil. To me, that's you're making a point, but I think you can find fertilizer sources a lot cheaper than trying to grow hay and spend all the time and effort putting up dry hay to have it go back into the soil. And again, the same thing. These are stored outside, running north-south with bales butted tightly together with no space between the rows. And you can see that all the water and the wastage is accentuated by those bales being close and tightly together. Again,
but I know everybody knows this too. Remember though, you got 50% of the bale on the outside, 20, 25% of depth. So if you're losing your outside foot on a 4x5 bale, you lost 50%, darn it.
Exactly.
I could run the numbers and figure it out exactly, but it's close enough. You're losing a ton of hay.
Has anybody ever seen this? I mean, I see this too, but just think about where the wastage is when you do this, and you can see there's a huge amount of waste. And this, I thought these color photos are great in terms of actually showing how much you're losing. So that top bale's all right. Okay, it's doing okay, but all the other bales on the bottom are really suffering in terms of the amount of loss. And really, again, you're talking about, more than 50% loss on this bale in terms of the amount of volume of hay that's on the outside.
And one thing I would say, I mean, a lot of folks wrap hay. If you have the space, or if you already use a tube wrapping system, we see a lot more people tube wrapping dry hay. Yep, there's a cost for plastic, but if you're opposed to building a hay barn, fine, spread your costs out over 20 years and wrap it. But I know what you lose leaving a bale unprotected. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've looked at what I could pave in my barns for to get rid of the soil moisture from the soil in the bottom. I mean, I probably could put down a vapor barrier and enough gravel to make it much cheaper, but I'm willing to look at $5,000, $10,000 cost to get rid of the moisture underneath the bale with a roof over the top and walls around it, and still think it's cost effective versus, let alone leaving it outside.
And this is looking at bales. These are net wrapped bales, but stored on a pallet or on the ground. And even stored on a pallet, we're getting considerable amount of loss, especially when you get into having them stored for almost 11 months early. Just the loss accentuates itself over time. So.
And you don't really get to throw away all that bad hay. Your animals eat some of that. And when you really want to get into nutrition, feeding them high NDF, high fiber diets is going to reduce what they can actually consume in total, and they're going to not have as much nutrients. They're not going to gain. They're not going to get as good. You're not going to make as much milk. You're not going to make as high quality beef. You're not going to, whatever you're trying to do is probably not going to work as well, or you're going to have to make it up with a grain bill that's going to add to your cost. So this stuff is all just pure loss.
So I just want to throw that in there to end with that. So especially when hay
go.
prices are what they are right now.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you guys for presenting today. And I want to remind everyone that next week we're going to have Granite State Grazer's own Elena Enzian doing a webinar on livestock handling. So please sign up for that. And just remember, even if you can't attend, if you sign up, you'll get a recording. The recordings will all be placed online at one point, but we're not sure when that's going to be. So if you want the recording sooner rather than later, register for the webinars, whether you can attend them or not. And everyone have a great week.
One last thing, Sarah asked if that was for open bales or covered. Those are all open bales. None of that was for covered hay. Covered hay, the storage is 100 times better. These are bales left outside. Sorry.
My pet peeve.
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope that was useful for everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.